welcome. As Deirdre said, I'm Christine Carter, and I'm the executive director. Oh, I need to stand closer to the mic. Jason's telling me. I'm the executive director of the Greater Good Science Center. And before we get started, I wanted to take just a minute to tell you all what the Greater Good Science Center here at UC Berkeley does. We are an interdisciplinary research unit here on campus that is dedicated to promoting research, scientific research on things like happiness and altruism and compassion. So I think just our focus on those sorts of things makes us pretty unique, but really the thing that makes us most unique is our goal to disseminate that sort of research, to get the word out about research on things like happiness and strong families and altruism and compassion, to getting the word out to people like parents and practitioners who can really put it into practice in their personal lives and in their professional lives. And to that end, of course, our greatest vehicle for doing that is Greater Good magazine, which if you haven't all seen a copy of it, there are lots of copies that were out on the table out there. And where are they now? They'll be back there. So I hope that if you haven't seen Greater Good magazine, that you'll take the time to pick up the latest issue, which focuses on play, and we're going to talk about one of the articles in there. The other things that we do to try and get the word out about all this great research, we have a website that has a couple of blogs, and I'd like to call your attention to a relatively new area of the website, which is about the science of raising happy children. So if any of you are parents out there, I hope that you'll check that out. And then, of course, also events like this are really help us serve our goal of getting the word out about some of this great research. And we hope that it will really give you a chance to interact with the researchers and understand it all a little bit better. Okay, so if you'd like to know more about the Greater Good Science Center, there are also some brochures on the back table that have all of our web addresses and things like that, and a subscription form if you decide you'd like to subscribe to the magazine. We'd be delighted. Okay, so before we go any further, I'd like to say a special thank you to a whole host of people. And although they aren't here, I'd like to recognize and send out thanks to donors to the Greater Good Science Center. Everything we do has been made possible by a really very small group of donors and their financial contributions. So, namely, those are Tom and Ruth Ann Hornaday, who are Cal alumni, and the Herb Alpert Foundation has done a lot of funding of the magazine. I'd also like to recognize our co-sponsors of this event tonight, which are, of course, the magazine program here at the Journalism School and the Harold E. Jones Child Study Center, which is where our offices are. And to say a special thanks to Sage Diltz and Marsha Parker here at the J School for their help really organizing this event, and to Milt Wallace and Paul Grabowitz for their help recording it. Okay, and last but not least, I would really like to thank all of our readers, because it is really your support that keeps us going. In the last year, subscriptions to Greater Good Magazine have increased tenfold, and a lot of that is due to your word-of-mouth support. So thank you very much, and keep up the good work. Okay, without further ado, I'm now going to turn it over to the managing editor of Greater Good Magazine, Jeremy Smith.
Thank you, Christine. And by the way, this is Christine's husband and her two daughters on the cover, and that is Sebastian, who is the son of our designer, Alfonso Yaramillo. So, and this is our play issue. Why we do it, why it's declining, and how we can get it back. In researching the play issue, we discovered that kids are playing less and less. There's been a measurable decline in the amount of play that kids are doing. At the same time, research is revealing, more and more research is revealing how important play is to physical, psychological, social, and even moral development. A lot of animals have been observed playing. There's been a lot of speculation about why that is. Some people think that they do it to train their brains to deal with the unexpected. The biologist Mark Beckhoff has theorized that play is a vehicle for animals to develop a simple, straightforward sense of right and wrong. For example, when kangaroos are boxing, if somebody cheats or if they're too aggressive, they'll be ostracized from the group. And this brings us to video games. I knew as soon as we started to put the issue together that I wanted to do something on video games. And I think that video games do a lot. There's evidence to indicate that video games do a lot to accomplish these goals of play. Evidence says, research says that it does train the brain to deal with the unexpected. It does develop a specialized set of motor skills. But at the same time, there's a lot of concerns. There's a lot of fears. A lot of people fear that it actually inhibits children's socialization and that it actually inhibits the development of a strong sense of right and wrong. But now we have over 2 decades of research into the effects of video games, excuse me, especially violent ones. Lawrence Kuttner and Cheryl K. Olson are the co-authors of one of the newest and most authoritative studies of violent video games to date, summarized in their new book, the sensationalistically titled Grand Theft Childhood, which is on sale at the back, and I encourage everybody to buy one and make Larry's time out here worthwhile. He is the co-founder and director of the Center for Mental Health and Media, based in the Department of Psychiatry at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, and he's on the faculty at Harvard Medical School. He wrote the award-winning weekly New York Times column, Parent and Child, and he was the Ask the Expert columnist for Parents magazine. In recognition of that work, the American Psychological Association gave him its National Psychology Award for the best newspaper writing about psychology in the United States. Kuttner is the author of 5 previous books on child development and parent-child communication. His new book, Grand Theft Childhood, is written with Cheryl K. Olson, who is also his wife, and that's the result of a $1.5 million study funded by the U.S. Department of Justice on the effects of video games on young teenagers. Also joining Professor Kuttner is Stephen Hinshaw, who is the chair of the psychology department here at Cal. His main research interests lie in the fields of clinical child and adolescent psychology and developmental psychopathology. The major themes of his work include the diagnostic validity of childhood disorders, the role of peer relationships, the utility of identifying subcategories of aggressive behavior, and the early prediction of behavioral and learning problems. He's the author of many other books, and he's the author of the forthcoming book, The Triple Bind, The Hidden Crisis in Today's Teenage Girls. He's also the co-founder of the Greater Good Science Center, which publishes Greater Good magazine. And here representing game developers is Greg Niemeyer, who received his MFA from Stanford University in new media in 1997. At the same time, he founded the Stanford University Digital Arts Center, which he directed until 2001. Today, he's associate professor of new media, and he focuses on the critical analysis of the impact of new media on human experiences. And he also develops games, and his creative work focuses on the mediation between humans as individuals and humans as a collective through technological means, and emphasizes playful responses to technology. So not all video games are about shooting things. His most recognized projects are Gravity, Ping 2.0, Good Morning Flowers, and with Joe McKay, The Balance Game. His current project, the ominously titled Black Cloud, an alternate reality game, is funded by the MacArthur Digital Learning Initiative. And I think you're going to be showing us some of that tonight, right? Another game. Okay, very good. So that's our panel. Please give them a hand, especially to Larry, for coming out. Thank you very much. This book is on sale right over there. And without any further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Kangaroos, eh?
Kangaroos.
There are some chimps down at Emory who play a video game and that's mounted into a tree. It's a very interesting thing. I'd like you to imagine a time in our country's history in which several members of Congress have been caught taking bribes from lobbyists, in which the Vice President of the United States has ties to a major construction company that's received a lot of very profitable no-bid and low-bid contracts from the government. And because in part of upcoming elections, legislators are looking for a way to distract the public from some of the bigger issues, And so you start hearing statements about a disturbing new medium and its effects on youth, such as, quote, "It's corrupting the young, glamorizing criminal behavior, and is responsible for the fearful increase in youthful criminals in our cities in recent years." Now, one of the joys of being in Berkeley and being here at Cal is I know that with this intellectual crowd, you immediately know that I'm talking about the Credit Mobilier scandal of 1873. And that quote was in reference to the new medium of that time that was supposedly going to have terrible effects on teenagers, especially teenage girls, the paperback novel. We have a long history of panics over new media in this country. We've seen it in my generation, at least, back in the 1950s. There was tremendous concern about comic books, and there were Senate and congressional hearings on this, just as we've had them on violent video games. There actually were Senate hearings as to whether Batman and Robin were a gay couple. You go back another generation or so to the 1930s, the new medium of that time was the gangster film, where sound played such a critical element in it. There are iconic sounds from gangster films. And you were not allowed to show, for example, the dynamiting of trains out of fear. The teenage boys would blow trains up all over the world. Same thing in the late 19th, early 20th century with the paperback novels. It's absolutely fascinating. Our center, the Center for Mental Health and Media, was approached several years ago to look into the effects of playing violent video games on violent behaviors in the real world among young teenagers. And we looked at the literature that was out there. We wanted to see who had done what work. It was always addressed in these position papers as if everything was known already. And what we saw, unfortunately, was what might best be called questionable research. A lot of times it was overblown findings from poorly designed studies that were then misinterpreted, kind of a triple threat. They suffered from several particular problems. One was poor definitions or no definitions of such key issues as what is violence, and especially how is violence different from aggression. They were often experimental studies done with atypical populations. The most common design involved taking Psych 101 students. So we have 18, 19-year-olds taking a psych course and want to make a little extra money or get a little extra credit. And they're exposed to a game that's a new game for roughly 15 minutes. And then they have to perform a task. And it involves something like the Taylor Competitive Reaction Time Test, which is a noise blast. And from fraction of a second differences in the noise blast length, there were conclusions about the influence of violent video games on violence in the real world. And we had some questions about the validity of that leap of faith as we saw it. There also were some generalizations from other media, and it's always good to try to look at research from other media and extend it on. But violence within our culture and the perception of violence in media is very much a moving target. And when you look at linear media like television, and you look at some of the studies that were done in the 70s and 80s, and many of them published as late as the 90s, that looked at violent television, what was included in their definition of violent television included such programs as The $6 Million Man, Starsky and Hutch, and Roadrunner cartoons. So we have difficulty going from arcade-based video game play from a decade ago to the current environment. You can imagine the leap from other linear media with this. And what happened was in 2004, we received a grant from the U.S. Department of Justice, the Office of Juvenile Justice Programs, for $1.5 million to do 2 years' worth of research, doing something that other researchers, quite frankly, had not done. It was an absolutely radical approach to this. We talked to the kids. And we put together a team of people that was really a great team. It was one of the best teams I've ever worked on in my life. We had psychiatrists, psychologists, epidemiologists, public policy people. We had an evolutionary biologist working with us. We had some new graduates from college working as research assistants who got to tell their parents that they got a job at Harvard because they were good at video games, so there. But they're all in PhD programs now, so we've turned them. And what was great about it is we all had these different professional backgrounds. Some of us were parents, some of us were not parents. Some of us were gamers, some of us were not gamers. Some of us thought that, this stuff has got to cause major problems. Some of us thought, come on, it's ridiculous. It can't cause anything. It's a trivial political issue with that. So there was great disagreement among ourselves, and that kept us on our toes. We had to question fundamental assumptions. Now, one thing became clear very quickly. If you look at the population as a whole, violent crime among youth has gone down and gone down significantly over the past 15 to 20 years. The reporting of violent crime has gone up. That is the media coverage of it. But violent crime itself has gone down. Video game play has gone up exponentially. So if you're looking at the entire population, it doesn't make sense to think that an average kid playing video games, violent video games, is going to be led down this path of becoming a sociopathic killer. But what we didn't know is, are there certain patterns of play that might serve as markers of problems in the real world? Are there certain kids who are at greater risk? If we were going to allocate scarce resources, which kids should we be paying attention to? Where should we be worried? And the other issue is, are there things that are beneath the radar that we aren't paying as much attention to? One of the examples I give in terms of college-age kids, there's tremendous publicity when there's a school shooting in a college. And we had some horrible things happen at Northern Illinois and at Virginia Tech, and they involved roughly 45 or 50 kids. We have, on average, 1,000 suicides per year of students on college campuses. If you want to stop unnecessary death among college students, you don't focus on people who come in with a gun and shoot others. You focus on suicide. But that is beneath the radar. That doesn't get the publicity. So we wanted to know, are there issues, perhaps bullying, for example, that might be below the radar that we need to take a look at by studying this. And what we did is we had a written survey that was administered to approximately 1,250 boys and girls, everyone who showed up at school at a certain day. It was in multiple states, wide SES. We can't really generalize to the entire country, but it's a pretty diverse group. We were underrepresented in Latinos and overrepresented in some other groups. But it was a pretty broad socioeconomic status group. It is the largest study of its type. And we looked into things like who played and where and when and why. This is a journalism school, so I have to say who, what, why, when, where, and with whom. What are the patterns there? We also did a written survey of more than 500 of their parents. We also did focus groups as formative research to help develop this. And we talked to 42 kids. In this case, it was all boys because disagreeing amongst ourselves, we thought this would be a boy-related issue. We were wrong. But we did this with 42 boys who already were playing M-rated games. We didn't want to expose them to stimuli or things that they were not already exposed to. Since I work for a medical institution, we have the same release forms for any type of research, whether you're getting an experimental liver transplant or you're participating in a focus group. So we actually had to say with a straight face to them, if you suffer any side effects from this focus group, go to the nearest emergency room. I would sometimes ad lib, and I can guarantee which department will see you. We found from our focus groups of parents, because we talked to the kids in one room and parents in another room, the parents had 4 categories of concerns about video games. One of them is kids spending too much time, that they were not getting schoolwork done or not getting chores done. They were concerned that playing video games might interfere with the development of critical skills, especially social skills. They were concerned about sexual content and nudity in some of the games. and they were concerned about violence in the games, but they disagreed about the nature of the violence they should worry about. And they had very different concerns about their kids as opposed to everyone else's kids, which also is quite interesting. They were most concerned about violence against realistic humans. They didn't care about zombies or orcs. They didn't care about killing dragons. They wanted to know, is there issues that related to their values? You know, were they misogynistic? Were there violence against women, against minorities? They wanted to know about the context and goals of the violence, and were very frustrated that they couldn't get this information from the ratings or from the content descriptors. For example, there are games, there's a series called SWAT, where you are rewarded for not using violence and not shooting people. You're rescuing people. Another game called Hitman obviously has different rewards to it, but they have the same rating. And parents were frustrated they could not get the information about those issues they wanted to use as part of their judgment by looking at either the M or T rating on it, or E rating, or the content descriptors, you know, mild violence, or whatever it happens to be. Comic mischief. I still can't figure out what comic mischief is on one of these. And what we found is that our research has been cherry-picked by both sides, if I can set them up as two sides here, and people are taking aspects of what we say and making broad claims that are not really reflected in our research. When Grand Theft Auto was released a little over a week ago, my wife did a series of interviews, 2 of them for local TV stations in Boston, where we're based, and she gave them pretty much the same sound bites. And we watched both stories, and the first story, the reporter said that researchers say there's nothing to worry about at all with violent video games, and then had the soundbite from Cheryl. And the other story, they said some researchers are gravely concerned about the influence of violent video games, and then used the same soundbite from Cheryl. So sometimes data will never interfere with preconceived notions. We wanted to look at how 12 to 14-year-old kids played games. We found a couple of things. Almost half the boys played more than 6 hours per week, and 1 in 8 played 15 or more hours per week. And that's a good chunk of time. We found that boys were 10 times as likely as girls to play 15 hours or more per week. About a third of the boys, 10% of the girls, play every day. Only 6% of the kids said they had never played any electronic games in the past 6 months, and 1% said they never played any electronic games at all. So this is clearly normative behavior, especially for boys. Among girls who played games, about 1 in 3 had played at least one M-rated game. Remember, they're 12, 13, 14. M-rated means 17 and up. M-rated game, quote, a lot in the past 6 months. And among boys, over 2/3 regularly played at least one M-rated game. When we asked them what games you've played a lot in the past 6 months, give us a list, we found that the brand of games, or the cluster of games that were most popular for the boys at this age, number 1 was Grand Theft Auto. Number 2 was Madden Football, Madden NFL. For the girls, number 1 was The Sims. Number 2 was Grand Theft Auto. And that blew us away. We did not expect that. Now, since we had not expected it, we didn't have the resources to really do in-depth research. But we got some possible insights as to what might be going on, in that the girls described playing the games differently. Now, this is only anecdotal, but they described playing the games differently than the boys did. The boys tend to go on missions and rise through the ranks and blow up things and steal cars and shoot people. The girls described delivering pizzas, driving an ambulance, trying on clothes. They used it as a rich environment, kind of like a cooler version of The Sims. So we need to look into that and see what's going on. Another thing that surprised us, but it's one of those things where after you hear it, you go, well, duh. As adults, we often think of video games as an isolating experience. A kid goes down to the basement and plays alone in this weird world. No, you talk to kids, and for them, it is a social experience. It is very social. And the fact that I had seen this in my own son and in other kids, of course, didn't stop me from having that distorted perception when I started. More than half the boys and girls said they played for creative reasons. That's what they liked. They wanted to create their own worlds. They wanted to learn new things. 2/3 of the boys and almost a half of the girls said they played, quote, because it helps me to relax. Roughly 40% of them said they played video games, quote, to get my anger out. That's very interesting, we found. And we have, again, some anecdotal stuff from some kids who talked about, I was really angry at this kid at school. They've been bullied by him or whatever, and I went home and set up an avatar that looks kind of like the kid, and I fought with him. And at the end, I didn't feel like I had to go back and actually punch him. So we don't know. There may be this may be a positive effect. It's worth looking at. And we did find some possible problems associated with violent games. And again, we're talking about kids who list M-rated games among their favorites, and for want of a more creative term, we're calling them M-gamers. We found that M-gamer boys, aged 12 to 14, as opposed to non-M-rated M-gamer boys, were more than twice as likely to get into physical fights, to hit or beat up someone, to, quote, damage property for fun, to steal something from a store, to report poor school grades, or to get into trouble with a teacher or a principal. And we also found a dose-response relationship. The more games they played, the higher this was. Now, before you leap to conclusions, you have to know a couple of things here. This is a correlational study. We're not saying one causes the other. We don't know which way it goes. There may be a third factor. But the most important thing is what are called the base rates. These were still very rare problems. The majority of kids who were M gamers did not get into trouble at schools, did not have bad grades. And so to choose a number just as an example, if you have 2% in one group, and with the M-rated games it goes up to 6%, some people say there's a tripling of the risk. And other people say, well, yeah, 94% of the kids didn't do this. So you need to have that to keep it in perspective. What I'd like to end with is a quick excerpt from one of our focus groups, which will show you that no matter what the technology, 12, 13, 14-year-old boys are at heart 12, 13, 14-year-old boys. And they were much more concerned if they were to protect a younger sibling from things those kids could do in the real world, like cursing, for example. But when we started talking about sexual content, something came up here. And this is a transcript from a focus group, researcher. Are there any games that you think you shouldn't be allowed to play at age 13? Patrick, sort of like The Sims. It's a nonviolent game with that. Ramon, yeah, The Sims, because they go to people and like... Patrick, yeah, they like go to people and like... Ramon, kiss. Patrick, yeah. Researcher, so because of the kissing, you don't think you should be able to play that game? How old should you have to be? Ramon, kissing, like 15. Patrick, 15, yeah, maybe 14. Josh, I agree with both of them. Randy, also BMX XXX. Now, that's a game that involved BMX bike racing with nude women in a strip club. It was a public relations disaster, and the company went bankrupt. Researcher, how old would you have to be to play that game? Randy, 20. Josh, I disagree. You could be like 17 or 18. If you're 18 and you still live with your mom, and your mom comes in the room, and you just beat the level, and she sees the girl pull up her shirt, there's nervous laughter in the room. Researcher, so obviously you've played this. Patrick, see, he's played it. Josh, no, I haven't. Researcher, well, how do you know what she did? Josh, because in a magazine, researcher, you read about it. Yeah. Ramon, there's this new game coming out called Playboy the Mansion. Now, you take on the role of Hugh Hefner in both his business and private lives. Some of the kids in the room gasp. Ramon, that's not good for 8-year-olds. Patrick, that's for like 20-year-olds. Josh, that's for like 100. Thank you very much.
And now Stephen Henshaw.
Okay, so I'm a discussant and critic for a few minutes. So what does a good discussant or critic do? Sort of reviews the evidence. So from just hearing this nice talk and reading the book, just got mailed to me last week, what are some sort of key points? How would I summarize? Well, violent video games certainly have potential for problems, but we really may as a society be overblowing this potential. I mean, after all, from the dime novels and trash novels, I had the experience of watching with my 4.5-year-old just last weekend, Sylvester and Tweety Bird. Lots of violence in those. We've overblown this. It's been prevalent for a long time, and we always seem to blame the media for causing rashes of problems among kids. In fact, what Larry didn't really have time to mention, kids may use these games to work out conflicts and fantasies and understand social hierarchies. And this is a way of expressing thrill-seeking, which we know is a trait that is spread throughout the population. Also, he didn't get much of a chance to talk about, we all have limited time, there may be what we call in the lingo moderator variables or subgroups. Maybe kids with learning disabilities, maybe kids who are depressed, maybe kids with ADHD really get stuck on these games more than others, and it causes further isolation, depression, lack of willingness to do schoolwork, and we don't really have much research on that. Also, when, again, in some of the qualitative data from the book, kids express doing these games for reasons other than the stereotypes we all think, not just to maim people or get thrills, but, as we heard, well, to fight boredom and to be social. I mean, you can't really be social in an elementary and middle school and talk to kids unless you're doing the games that they're doing. So there's unexpected reasons why kids might be doing these. And, of course, the very first point that was made, we can't really blame violent video or violent media in general for the increase in crime among youth, because among boys, there's been a pretty slow, steady decline since about 1994 and 5. However, what was not mentioned is that girls' rates of violence have gone up about 30% in that same time period. So another moderator, another subgroup, how are girls using these games, which is, as we just heard, my latest book is about adolescent girls and many of the problems they have. So let's go a little bit deeper. Many would contend that, unlike other forms of media, video games are particularly realistic, graphic, interactive, and consuming. It's not just watching Sylvester and Tweety Bird. It's not just watching a cartoon or a movie. You're into it more. It's going to be more influential of development. And second, there's an explicitness about the killing and maiming that is more symbolic or funny or sarcastic in many other forms of media. Third, that it's a really passive way and an indoors way, as we heard, to express violence. If I'm really going to hurt somebody, I'm going to have to stand up and fight myself. But now, sitting or lounging in my room, I can do it, and it's kind of like a free violence. It's not really portraying the effort it would take. As we just heard, there's been a lot of explicit media links to, oh my God, the reason for the school shootings, Columbine 96 and the others, is really, these are kids who were sort of raised on violent video games. And the timing of this isn't quite right. We all know that certain factors that might have been influential, we think are influential, might have been a small part of many other factors that cause these rare pieces of school violence. And apropos to your comments, which I really appreciate, I just spoke last night in front of a student group on campus about suicide awareness week and month, and suicide is the third leading cause of death among kids and young adults, 15 to 24. The first two are accidents and homicides. So we're in the ball game here, and among the college population, suicides are more of a problem than campus shootings, etc. And finally, at this sort of deeper look, and I'm saying deeper in quotes, we all really know, don't we, that despite what the statistics show, these games are creating a generation of non-physically fit, passive, lurkingly violence-prone youth, and we're just waiting for the explosion. Well, what gives? Both views can't be right, can they? Well, let's look a little deeper at some evidence. Now, The book says there's problems with meta-analyses. Meta-analysis is a technique of trying to combine data from many individual studies, and you do statistics on those studies, so that rather than saying, well, this study found this and this did this, let's combine and see what the overall effect is with a sample size of many, many, many thousands as opposed to 10 or 20 or 50 or 100 or 200 in any given study. The biggest and most influential meta-analysis, not about violent video per se, but about all forms of violent media, was Craig Anderson and a number of illustrious colleagues' piece in Psychological Science and the Public Interest back in 2003. And Anderson does a lot of research in this area. There are 235 citations in the reference list, both experiments. Some kids get randomly assigned to watch this or play this versus that, and a fewer number of longitudinal studies where you sort of accumulate how many hours of exposure to violent media did a kid get, use that as a predictor along with everything else, neighborhood, gender, including how violent were they at the beginning, and try to follow and find the longitudinal relationship. So, what did Anderson et al. Conclude? That the vast majority of studies, experimental in nature, show a very clear effect of exposure to violence in some form of media and some form of aggressive behavior. Sometimes it's the white noise burst, which we'd say, well, how valid is that? Other times it's teachers or observers' impressions of kids or observations of kids in classrooms. Sometimes it's self-report. Sometimes it's official delinquency statistics. So a variety of measures. How big is this effect? Well, the effect size is, for those of you statistically minded, 0.2 to 0.3, which is considered small to medium, but it's actually bigger than the effect size of the effects of smoking on lung cancer and bigger than the effect size of the palliative effects of aspirin on later heart disease or heart problems. So there's something there. But whenever you find across many, many studies this kind of effect, there's got to be subgroups for whom this is a big effect and for whom it's a small. What about the longitudinal data? Well, again, trying to control for first how aggressive was this kid at the beginning, because there may be kids who are more violent or drawn to these games. Let's factor that out. How much of an increase in aggressive behavior do we find over 5, 10, 15, 20 years? Also controlling for the fact that kids more prone to violence may come from tougher neighborhoods or have a number of other risk factors. As you might guess, a much smaller database there, but still, incremental effects of the amount of exposure, dose dependent. The more exposure you get, the more likely you are to have, ranging from mild to serious, aggressive antisocial behavior problems later on. So this meta-analysis, well-cited, very good meta-analysis, got people thinking there's something here. There's some smoke and some fire. But what about selection? This is a big issue for all developmental researchers. Isn't it the fact that, well, in the work I do with kids with ADHD, we all know that if you eat a lot of sugar, it makes you more hyper, right? Wrong. Kids with ADHD actually eat a lot of sugar, but in every controlled study ever done, the group getting NutraSweet, not sugar, is more hyperactivity. So we can get fooled. So maybe it's really that kids who are more aggressive, they're drawn to these, whether it's TV or, in the case here, violent video games, and that's the effect. Well, we can try to statistically control for everything possible. Some of these longitudinal studies have, and there does seem to be a residual effect of the more exposure, regardless of whether you kind of selected in to watch this stuff in the first place or play these games, there still may be something there. Anderson et al. In their meta-analysis also found that even for kids who are essentially not aggressive at the baseline measure, dose response, the more exposure you had, and again, this isn't just video games, this is all forms of violent media, the more exposure you had, the more likely you were to show aggression later. Now there's a parallel here in a very important literature. It's a small literature. My former colleague at UCLA, Neil Malamuth, and Ed Donnerstein have done on pornography, and especially violent pornography. What are the effects? And they've done a meta-analysis too. It's very clear that there's selection, that guys who tend to watch porn, and especially who tend to watch violent porn, are already sexually abusive of women in the first place. But if you can control every ounce of that at the beginning, the more, not just pornography, but violent porn you watch, it leads to not just small, but medium and large effect size increases in that. So this is a real concern that there may be, now we're not talking about violent pornography, or are we in some violent video games which are quite sexual? It raises another level of concern. So, how to sum up? Do we do what, of course, all social policies in this country and probably all others go through waves? We reform this, we have a promise that everything will get better, and of course the reform was not well thought out, and things don't get better, and then there's a backlash, and then 20 years later we do reform again. So do we trash the internet, and do we stop violent video games, and thereby make them forbidden fruit, so more kids are attracted to them? Or do we have some other kind of policy, whether it's parental controls or whether it's different ways of inventing and creating these games that might yield different outcomes? Why might violent media predispose to or even trigger or cause, given the caveats of the research I just mentioned, increases in some of these behaviors in at least some kids? Well, maybe it's just simple modeling. Maybe it's that you get really aroused, the physiological arousal theory, or maybe once you watch and play again and again, you actually desensitize. Your nervous system that before is kind of reactive against violence, and now it's like, well, I'm kind of used to this. You get inured to it. We need a lot more studies of mechanisms that might either promote further violence or it might actually protect against it as the result of other kinds or even these kinds of games. From my perspective, what we really ought to be thinking about is, are there ways through, and there's a lot of critiques of the internet, let's not talk about violent video games for now, is the internet creating unprecedentedly creative ways for kids to construct worlds and do research and find out, or is it a way to just become passive and learn a lot of the crap that's on the internet, and if you actually have serious problems, like if you're a cutter, you can use the internet to get really good safe self-help from that, or you can use it as a how-to manual and learn how to become more anorexic or how to cut even more. Obviously, it cuts both ways, to use the metaphor. But are there, and I'm eager to hear our discussant coming up in just a second, creative uses of not only the internet, but of actual video games that might foster an appreciation of the broader world? It's not just about thrill-seeking. It's not just about escape. Some kids need to escape. There's a lot of pressures in the world. But can we foster a larger pro-social sense among kids through the media we've got, through the vastly improved internet over the years, and through the creation of the kinds of video games that might promote a different set of values and skills? So thanks a lot.
And next up is Greg Niemeyer.
Good afternoon. Thanks for coming. And thanks for the two wonderful presentations. This is a great discussion. Instead of reading the book, which I didn't have quite enough time to do, I decided to play Grand Theft Auto and version 4 and look at the situation from that perspective. Now, I don't develop violent games like Grand Theft Auto. That takes far more experience and skill than I have. But here at UC Berkeley, I do develop games that function the same way as Grand Theft Auto. All games are cultural artifacts for me. All games are designed to reflect very specific ways in which we can be in the world. A game will teach us not only how to be in the world, but how to succeed at being in that particular world in a particular way. So, for example, from tic-tac-toe, we might learn how you take turns. We don't just learn how to draw X's and circles, but we learn very fundamental things about being in the world, such as how to take turns. From a game like Grand Theft Auto, we might learn very specific things about the world as well, like what types of cars have what types of radio stations in them when you steal them. It's so there's a lot of modulation and precision in the world that is created in Grand Theft Auto, and when we engage with the game, we really engage with the whole model of the world, and we ask ourselves, well, how does this model work? And then we are transformed by our experience with that model, and we don't necessarily do exactly what the game suggests we do, but we at least have a set of alternatives that maybe we didn't try out before. And so games answer our question, what am I going to do next with a broader set of alternative options? Now, I have an example here of two very specific cultural artifacts that I'd like you to consider. They involve music, and I will play about a minute of each sample. And I'll start with the first one right here. It's a little bit less than a minute, but in gaming we always cheat with time a little bit. It goes a little faster than in real time. This is a painting of the Battle of the Bridge of Arcole from 1796, and the music you heard was Haydn's Mass for Times of War, Missa per tempi belli. And this mass was written in relationship to this particular the invasion of the Bonapartist armies into Austria. And the idea of the mass was essentially that a prayer to God to deliver us from evil and to forgive us for our sins and to take pity on us. That is really what it's all about. And you see the tone of the voice. There's a lot of people singing. There's a choir. There are drums in the mass. It's very rare that there's a drum in the mass. And also in this picture here, you see it's a contemporary painting as well. You see somebody, maybe this is Napoleon, greatly heroicized, crossing this bridge and eventually finding a way into Austria. And you see soldiers looking at each other, standing around, some soldiers in the process of dying, one in the process of falling down. Many of them are interacting with each other visually, and they have gestures and facial expressions. They're clearly a group of people doing a very particular action here. Well, the next slide is from contemporary times, and it looks a little different. There. This is the official song that went with the release of Gears of War, and the image we see here features one soldier with a very, very large gun facing the audience, however very isolated from the other two soldiers. And the song that goes with it, the line is, "Dreams in which I'm dying are the best I've ever had." There's a very strong sense of depression. The song was written in the 90s, I believe. It's a little older, but still contemporary enough. There's a dark skull that rises here. So if we go back to 1796, well, this is the battle I'd much rather be in than this one. However, I am in this one, and so that's the specificity with which games transfer to us cultural values, right? We are in a culture of isolation and a culture of aggression, and games definitely reflect that. I don't know if they produce that, but they definitely reflect that. When game developers think about making games, they think about something called replay value. How badly will you want to play this game again? And how much money will you be willing to spend to play it again? And so game developers specifically seek for addictive patterns that create addictive responses, so you want to play again and again. I do the same thing when I design a game. I also want to have replay value, but of course the types of values that I promote with games are a little bit different than the ones that, say, Gears of War would promote. Here's a game I worked on called The Balance Game together with Joe Mackay. This one right now is in clinical trial for treatment of people with balance disorders, such as dementia-related balance disorders. In the way the game works, this is an exhibit in Cairo. This happens to be a member of the Bin Laden family playing this game in Cairo, Egypt. And you see there's a balance board here that this player is standing on. And the balance board is the same as the one in the game. So when you play the game, you essentially deflect balls that come dropping into the board here into the correct colored hoop. And this is a very simple task, but it's very fast, so you have to be very precise with your balance and so forth. And what I was interested in is explicitly this question of violence. And, well, I think that the one thing we can do to avoid violent responses is to have sort of a balance-seeking response. Well, if this happens, I'm going to do that. In other words, a compensation response. And so here we can train that, perhaps, but I'm very happy to hear that the game is actually functional as a therapeutic device as well. So we're in clinical trial right now. We're not sure quite if it works yet, but we're very certain that the types of games we develop change our physical behavior and change our mental behavior and change our way of looking at the world. So with games like these, I hope we can reflect a society that is moving in a different direction than we're currently at. I think that's all for right now. Thank you very much.
Before I open it up to questions from the audience, do you guys have any questions for each other?
The musical chairs game. I have to move one more over.
Oh, comments.
We're missing a chair.
Yeah.
We're missing a chair.
It's an old tech game. The music stopped a while ago. We're still moving.
Any questions for each other? Comments? Open it up to the audience. Very good. All right. Woman in the front.
I have a question. Have you considered what I refer to as the residuals of the game? I think that games that are very forceful and very aggressive leave residuals in the brain. And I don't know what to do with it, but it's there. If I asked anybody here what was the scariest movie you ever saw and what part was it, I will get an answer. Very often it was Psycho in that shower scene, and I know people who didn't take showers for extra months. Now, that stays in the brain. And in some of the games, they are interactive. In Godfather, you get more points for strangling somebody than shooting them from a distance. Now, you can't tell me that goes away one day away. So what do you do about that?
I think we should repeat the question for the cameras to try to carry it out.
Okay, so the question was, what residual effects do games have on the human brain? And the study we're conducting right now, we're actually giving patients medications that will enhance the forming of strong synapses, so that while they play the game, they learn even more than they would normally learn. Now, we have to be very careful that they don't play The Godfather while they do this. This would be truly, truly disastrous. Now, I think that we are definitely training behavior. It's a very powerful effect, far more powerful than movies, because you are acting on it yourself. And so that is there. And as I said, it's a reflection of the types of values we have in our culture. So if you don't want this kind of thing in your mind, you don't want to go play these games. I don't watch horror movies at all. I can't do that. And so neither Silent Hill, that game I would never play. Yeah.
There's the opening forays now of fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging research on players of violent video games, looking at what's happening in the anterior cingulate cortex, what's happening in the limbic system. There are effects on the brain. There's an effect on the brain of everything we do, and the brain affects everything. It's all reciprocal, but we're starting to get a handle on at least cross-sectionally, what areas seem to be active in certain perpetration of or victimization from certain acts, but the long-term residuals is going to take a lot longer to figure out.
Yeah, I agree with what Steve was saying. I think fMRI studies are really a very, very potentially powerful tool at looking at this. A couple of things. One, I think we have to be careful about hyperbolic statements. You mentioned the shower scene in Psycho, one of the classic scenes of all times. But frankly, I really doubt that you know many people who did not take a shower for months after that. And there's a problem when people toss around those terms as if they're truisms, when really they're not. You know, we would expect a child who's 13 years old, 14 years old, maybe even a little older, definitely younger, who sees a Jet Li movie or who sees a Jackie Chan movie and people are punching each other and all that. You go to this local Cineplex afterwards, and they're all hyped up, and they're punching each other, and they're kicking each other. That's normal behavior. What we need to look at is both long-term from single or small-level exposure and long-term from multiple exposures of these. And we don't have those data yet. But we have to also clearly differentiate between short-term effects and long-term effects in different situations.
I have one more comment. Just briefly, I agree with all these things, but I also think that there's a carnival effect where, as I said, very, very specific effects in very specific games, so you can't generalize from a situation like that. But there's also the carnival effect. In a game like Grand Theft Auto, there's a lot of satire that is clearly designed to entertain us in a very particular satirical way, and that is not meant to make us into, urban monsters. And so, actually, that requires very close study to see if there's an effect of relief and displacement, and the mask effect of the carnival, where you get to be king for a day and the king gets to be a pauper for a day, and that sort of keeps social cohesion together. It's very important anthropological studies in that area.
Have we defined that as a variable in our study? Very simple answer: no. We did not look into that. We were, as I said, surprised at the participation of girls, the level of participation of girls in this. But you raise a very interesting issue, and something that is the sort of thing that parents, when they're looking at information on games, and what comes to mind to me in the games is a game called Bully, which takes place in a British boarding school, where there would be concerns about modeling specific behaviors for kids who are particularly sensitive to picking up on those behaviors, especially since from some of the studies done in the 70s, if you are looking for violent behaviors that are likely to be repeated in the real world, you look for attractive perpetrators, you look for realistic weapons, and you also look for humor put into it. If it's seen as funny and no consequences, all of those increase the likelihood that it would be done in the real world. But again, I would look at which kids specifically is there a population at risk, and then I'd immediately defer to Steve, who knows more about that than I do.
Well, it's a huge topic about how you define violence in boys or girls. And so just a couple of factoids is all we really have time for. Girls never used to be violent, right? But now that society has caught on, one of the reasons for the increase in aggression and violence in girls is that girls are getting labeled differently. A lot of girls' violence is fighting older siblings, stepdads, dads, people who are sexually abusing them. That used to be called something different. Now it's called assault. Girls, because of zero tolerance policies in schools, who used to be status offenders, are now violent offenders. So some of the increases, we've now recognized girls can be aggressive and violent, but we're labeling it differently. But I think there's still a real effect there. Why is this happening? Interesting book written a couple of years ago by Jim Garbarino of Cornell called See Jane Hit, kind of interesting title for a book on aggression in girls, is Title IX. Girls from an early age are now, schools have to have equal participation in sports for boys and girls, and so girls are learning to be physical. And if you've got other risk factors too, like you've been abused, or like you're from a lower class family, or you don't have a lot of protection, now you've got a taught way of getting even. Third, what about meanness and so-called girls' ways of aggressing, relational aggression? I'm not going to hit you, but I'm going to make sure you're excluded from the group, or I'm going to spread rumors, or I'm going to do all those things that, having run summer camps for girls, I know they're really good at doing. And they're better than boys at doing this, because girls are more verbal and they're more empathic, and they get what really hurts other girls better. So,
More efficient.
yeah, that's right. So all of this could get thrown into the equation as to what is aggression, what is relational aggression, what is violence. And anybody who studies this, you've got to define what your terms are. If you don't, you're really in a mess.
If I can add one quick thing to that, I was talking to the head of the Office of Juvenile Justice Programs, the Department of Justice, and we were asking about the increase that, Steve, you mentioned earlier, of girls' arrest for violent crimes. And he said a large part of it is when you have officers called to a household and there's a fight within the family, and disproportionately that is teenage girls and a parent, often a mother. There is a public policy now of mandated arrest. Right. This is because they were tired of someone abusing a spouse and no one goes to jail and then someone gets really hurt. So there's now mandated arrest. For the cops, if they arrest the mother, they have to call in social services to take care of the children. If they arrest the teenage girl, they can leave the other children with the mother. It's a much simpler arrest when they know someone's going to be out inside of 24 hours. And so that has distorted and skewed the statistics and caused part of this supposed increase in arrests for violent crimes of teenage girls, whereas 5 years ago, same behavior, they would not have been arrested.
On the other hand, the self-report data, when we ask kids directly, about 30 to 40% of high school boys in America say, I've hit or beaten up somebody bad enough that they needed medical attention, and 16 to 32% of girls. It's a wider window than for boys. But there is a real increase in girls, but there's also an artifact of the policies we have that have made that increase seem bigger than it really is.
All right. I'm going to call on the gentleman in the back.
Yeah.
You had your hand up earlier.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I have two questions. One actually goes to the residual issue, and it's an example which might be useful as we go forward thinking with this. I had a young brother who was very much violent games. He played Diablo, played Warcraft, all of the sort of violence. And at some point he developed carpal syndrome, where he couldn't play the games anymore.
Carpal tunnel.
Carpal tunnel syndrome, thank you. And so he got away from that for a while. And then he went separation, and then he was kind of depressed. He went to Victoria, met my sister. They had marijuana, they had pot, and he had a psychotic break. It was the first time he did marijuana, and he disappeared for a day. I flew up to kind of find him, and we couldn't find him for a day. And after 40 hours or so, we got a call from him. He had checked himself in at the Grand Empress Hotel, which is a $300 a night hotel. And he was a student, so I was concerned about his financial well-being. And I was like, Roger, what are you doing? He said, I'm taking care of myself. Okay. So I go see him, and then I asked him, so what have you been doing the last couple of days? And he told me he had been walking around Victoria, and he had been imagining himself with weapons killing people and using weapons. At first, it sent a chill through my mind. And then the way he started describing it, I remember scenes that he had shown me from Diablo from a couple of years previously. And so, I don't know, maybe this is just one case, but it kind of burned my mind that there is some sort of residual something that can be triggered by psychotic breaks or use of marijuana, I don't know. So, who could have thought?
Well, let me address a couple of things, and it's always tough in a big group like this when there's an individual crisis or difficulty to comment, so I'll try to make some general points. There's some interesting studies now out that show that there's this age-old question: do kids who tend to be prone to psychotic behavior smoke a lot of grass, or it's a selection effect I talked about a few minutes ago, or do people who smoke tend to become psychotic? And there's some recent evidence that if you have a certain single gene with a certain form and you've smoked a lot of grass in your early teen years, that really predicts schizophrenia and psychosis. So it's a real interaction of your genotype and that experience. Now, in your brother's case, I don't know a single exposure. Maybe he had some proneness. And what about his exposure to the violent games from before? It would be like saying, well, people who become psychotic have delusions that they're Napoleon, so we shouldn't teach history, right? A lot of people are exposed to violent video games and don't have that reaction. A lot of people are exposed to Napoleon in history books and don't have the delusion that they're Napoleon. On the other hand, it may be, a la Larry's moderator variables, that there are certain subgroups who are really vulnerable to the reality and the engagedness in some of these violent games, and we have to be on the lookout for that.
All right. Just for variety's sake, I'm going to call on her in the corner there, and then I'm going to get back to you folks.
I'm interested in gameplay amongst younger kids, sort of in the teen, like lower teenagers that your study, I think, addresses. And there's a dialogue that I have with some of my colleagues. I was wondering if you might be able to comment on it. And we talk a lot about kids and violence in games. And there's two sort of lobbies in our group. One that thinks that, assuming the same violent behavior against non-human characters in a game, some say that it's okay if the child is not the aggressor and they're only doing something in defense, and others say it doesn't matter whether the child is the aggressor or not. So I just was wondering if you had any thoughts about whether or not it matters if the child is the first to strike in a violent situation versus defending themselves.
Okay, the question has to do with, does it matter if your child is the aggressor, the first person to strike, and you're talking about an unrealistic target, not a realistic human and all that. We can parse this forever. I'm not sure how helpful that is. I think it has to be a judgment call on the part of parents and your values and knowing your kids. What I can tell you from the data that we gathered is that violence per se was not what the kids said they found interesting. What they wanted was a complex, interesting plot and interesting characters. And many of the games happened to be M-rated, and so they went for that. The majority of games they listed among their favorites were not M-rated, both for boys and for girls. And if we're looking at what sorts of things attract kids and whether they're likely to do it, I think we have to pay attention to that they're really drawn by the complexity. When we ask them about games that are essentially all violent, games like Manhunt, Postal, not a single kid of the 1,250 mentioned one of those games among their favorites. Not one. And we asked some of them in focus groups, what about them? And they said they were boring because they were just about violence. That wasn't what they were interested in.
I think that role-playing is very, very important to start understanding this. And in most games, you'll have a narrative setup that will tell you what your role is. Like Max Payne, for example, comes home one day and finds his whole family killed, and there the story begins. And so oftentimes, even if you're persistently aggressive in the game, your narrative will be that you're actually defending yourself or upholding something. Or in Grand Theft Auto 4, the narrative is essentially an immigrant narrative, and it's also a narrative of a revenge. And those themes are putting people, even if they're aggressive, into a defensive role.
All right, let's see. Who's most deserving? I'll go on this one here. Yeah.
Yeah. I have two quick questions for you, so either one respond. One is the escape factor. I feel, or so you said, I think that kids learn to succeed within a particular world of the video game, and that's great. My concern, however, is we've got a real world out here, a planet to be saved, and are these video games actually training them, or is it a diversion? Is it just a nice trick to keep them busy, just like TV in the 50s? Are we not paying attention? There are endangered species to be saved. Well, you got the picture, so that's number one. Number two is relationships, boys and girls. Okay, boys can play with boys and do their video games, cool, it's social. But how has the relationships between boys and girls changed? Or the high-tech family where nobody talks to each other anymore. You know, aren't we learning from mom, you know, how we deal with our future girlfriend, or are we just gonna text message, goodbye, relationship is over? So I'm kind of concerned as a mom of an 11-year-old daughter, what kind of boyfriend material is gonna be out there. So that's my second point. To you.
I can get us started. So in the Gears of War is a game where actually there's an oil crisis, and humanity has decided to drill deeper, and they find some source of energy that is protected by another species that lives underground, the locusts. So it really is a global warming kind of game. And of course, the answer to global warming is violence, right? So you have to kill the locusts to get the juice, and then you're okay. And the Black Cloud game I'm developing right now addresses both of your points, which is one is to try and develop alternative strategies for relating large-scale data to individual action, like large-scale studies about climate change to individual action. And the other is to bring people to work with each other within a community to address problems collectively. I think that Gears of War would do neither of these. It would allow us to solve problems about environment with violent means and pretty much in isolation. And that is a cultural demise of our own ending. You know, we're anticipating how it will end in the way we imagine these games, and so it's an image of how things might turn out.
I think we have to be careful about setting up false dichotomies here and saying, well, games are not helping solve the world's problems. Well, most books are not helping solve the world's problems. Most magazines, most lectures at Cal are not helping solve the world's problems.
A few are.
Yeah, none of the ones at Harvard are. So I have some perspective here. But, you know, we need a sense of, you know, why are we doing this? You know, we can't have everything be towards a particular goal. I can tell you from the experience of my 18-year-old son, who is fascinated with international politics. He is spending the summer learning intensive Arabic. He's interested in Middle Eastern affairs and in Far Eastern affairs. His interest was stimulated by video games when he was younger. Not Grand Theft Auto, but some of the games where you get to create your own world, Age of Empires, you know, historical recreations, doing things where you set up your own political system and see what it's like. And he found that fascinating. And that inspired him to read more about this and to sit in on lectures on this. He's been attending lectures at the Kennedy School of Government as an 18-year-old. So we can't say the medium is bad. No one would say, I don't allow books in my house because some books are violent. And yet I sometimes hear people say that about video games or even television.
I didn't. It was a question regarding the bigger community obligation.
The bigger community obligation is to play more games. like this, you will know what they are about, and you can interact with and bond with your children in the framework of the game itself.
All right, we have not very much time, so let's see. How about this gentleman here?
I'd like to sort of follow from the last remark a little bit, but I've heard you guys talk, and mostly it's about how games aren't that bad. It's not as bad. The data is more mixed than sort of the other media makes it out. But I'm very much interested in this as applied science, as a parent of a 12-year-old. And as a former gamer myself, I'm not particularly a fan of them. And what is the case for actually allowing it in the house, for encouraging it? Is there a case for saying yes? And well, talking here, you know, realistically about exposure to commercially popular games, not to, you know, special things that we might watch only in Berkeley.
I think part of the case is what I said with, you know, my own son, that in his case it spurred his interest in other fields. Now he also likes Max Payne, for example, and some things like this. He likes a good film noir story, and I think the exposure to what a good story is, you know, another advantage. Keep in mind that most books, most films, most television programs, most video games are bad. Not bad in terms of evil, but just, you know, poorly thought out, poorly constructed. They're hack jobs. But, you know, there are some good ones, and if you get the right stuff, be it the right films or books, or things that resonate with a person, they can be highly inspirational.
I'd like to hear from the other gentleman.
I think again, you need to be deeply involved in what your children are playing and play as much of it yourself if you can bear it. And it's such an important way of bonding and understanding what kinds of skills they're acquiring. Every game has very specific. It's like saying medicine, is it good or bad? Well, there is bad medicine and there's good medicine and there's good medicine poorly administered, etc. And there's the opposite. And so it's very much a question of dosage and of a very precise understanding of what games do. It's eventually the stories you told your children will be the values that they are going to act on in the world. And the same is true for games. And so it's really important to find the right ones or to come up with your own. And probably it's also important not to have them all be online because there is something like the real world we have to be able to relate in. So the benefits are that people who play games a lot have extremely sophisticated responses to complex narratives and that they're able to make decisions at extremely high frequencies. So an average gamer makes a decision every 10th of a second, which is just amazing. And those are the skills we will need to compete in the job market of tomorrow because that's pretty much the fastest rate we can go at as human beings, and games train us to do so.
And I'll just make a point. In between books and video games, it's like saying, should I have the computer turned on and plugged into the internet or not? It all depends. There's such crap out there on the internet, and it's a window on a world of research in a keystroke that I never dreamed about when I was in high school or college. And so, but I would really agree with what we just heard. Kids will pick up on the values around them in the home and the ways, the narratives that are constructed around the games they play and the things they watch.
All right. I think the gentleman in the black T-shirt and the woman in the red shirt here are bursting with passion. I can sense their passion. So 2 quick questions and maybe 3 to 6 quick answers. So, gentleman in the black T-shirt.
All right. Well, really quick, as an avid gamer who's played all the games you guys have now thus far mentioned and discussed, and enjoyed the betting made ones of me. We've heard a lot about concerns and risks. Can you guys address some of the positives? Because I know, as a gamer, first of all, much of what you discussed earlier, it's fun to imagine something else. In fact, it's fun to put yourself in a role that you would never, in the real world, want to be in. It's fun to play these roles. But more importantly, what's really interesting is my roommate and I typically play these games together, and we found that we're actually a lot more sensitive to real-world events that are akin to things we've experienced in the games, but not necessarily in the way we were in the game. So if we play Grand Theft Auto, and we hear about someone going to town, someone stealing a car, someone doing something ridiculously violent that reminds us of the game, that's sick to us. I mean, that is more appalling than it was before because now we connect it and we distinguish between a game and the world. What's okay in the game, what's okay in a role you play to be good and successful at this game, you have fun doing it, is not okay in the world. We make these distinctions. And can you talk about some of the positives of role-playing and understanding consequences of your actions in the game, and then also being able to distinguish between your fantasies that you have fun with and what you do in the world?
I think you've largely answered your own question in the way you posed it. I can tell you, no, don't apologize for it. Take credit for it. I can tell you again, speaking from our research, it was very clear that the young teenagers knew the difference between fantasy and reality. And one of the things they said they appreciated about many of the games they played was the unreality of it, that they liked being able to try on new worlds and try on roles that they would never do in the real world to experience what that was like.
Role-playing is very important to gain different perspectives on the world. So if you can engage in various roles and you can look at situations from different aspects, you are a richer person. And it's up to you to choose what values you will act on, but alternatives are crucial to making intelligent choices.
All right, woman in the red shirt.
I am the mother of a 13-and-a-half-year-old who's an RPG gamer.
Yeah.
And I think that it's really, I mean, there's a lot of things about it that I really like. Oh, the other day I was listening to this beautiful music. I said, what's that music? That song is so beautiful. And it was that song. He was playing that game, Gears of War. And he's one of these people, and he's a kid too, who'll say that when he feels really angry, he likes to play because he gets his anger out. But I think that another piece that we haven't really talked about, because I hear people say, oh, this is isolating. My son goes to this place, Eudaimonia, on Friday nights, where there's like 1,000 play online with squads and battalions or whatever, and you have to learn to play as a team. And my son plays with people from China and Australia, and he gets really interested in what's going on in the country. And I think finally, that, I'm hearing people say, well, don't games do this and don't games do that. Depends on what else your family's doing, what else your kid is doing. I mean, if the only thing that they're doing, they're not going to school, they're not talking to anybody, they're not eating, and all they're doing is playing games, I think that's a different story. But a lot of these kids have other interests. My son's now into paintballing, for example. But I mean, there's a lot of things that he likes to do, and that his friends like to do. And a lot of the kids that he makes friends with at Eudaimonia or these game places are the same kids that he goes to the movies with or he does other things with. And it's a way of kids keeping in touch with each other, too.
Yeah, that particular game, World of Warcraft, is very good at teaching us how to manage international workforce, and it is very. It's a game in which you form guilds, and there's essentially a dichotomy. There's two powers that battle each other out, and there's again a narrative that justifies the violence. But what you have to do is be part of a team and collaborate across geographic boundaries effectively to solve problems. And that's pretty much what our jobs will look like in the future. So make sure your son applies to Berkeley, please.
Well, I'm sure he'd love to talk to you because he wants to develop games.
Yeah, good.
All right, I'm going to allow one more question. This gentleman in the gray shirt is dying.
What did the Senate conclude on the Batman and Robin thing?
That's definitely the last question.
I'm going to leave that one as an open question. They were very concerned about Wonder Woman as well, by the way, and there are long transcripts about that. And Wonder Woman was developed by a psychologist.
Right.
All right.
Thank you very much.